Hello, everyone. It's so good to see all of you. I see a lot of familiar faces, some of which are familiar faces from the last time I covered the West Virginia legislature, which was about a decade ago. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Erica Peterson, and I'm the managing editor of Mountain State Spotlight. I've been in this job since October, and I am so excited to be back working in West Virginia. I've spent the past decade in Louisville, and before that, I worked at West Virginia Public Broadcasting in Charleston. First of all, thank you again so much for joining us tonight. We're really excited for the start of this year's legislative session. This is our first legislative session that we have existed as an organization, though some of our reporters have covered the session before for different news outlets. And over the past few weeks, we've been asking people what they want from our coverage. And if you didn't fill out the survey, we want to get input from you later on this evening too. But first, you will see a quick poll pop up on your screen. Never mind, it is not going to let me do that. So we will just leave that for later on this evening. But anyway, what we heard from you in the survey is that you want depth. You want to know how bills moving through the legislature affect you. You want to know the effects on the most vulnerable people in our communities. You want to know a bill's origin story. Where did it come from? Who wrote it? Are there any conflicts of interest that the public might not be aware of? These are some, but certainly not all of the questions that'll guide our reporting over the next 60 days. We'll be publishing our stories on our website, mountainstatespotlight.org, and provide them for free to all media outlets across West Virginia to republish. I'm happy to report that we have nearly 24 partners who have already taken us up on this, and you can read Mountain State Spotlight stories in newspapers from Beckley to Pocahontas County to Point Pleasant to Martinsburg, as well as on digital sites like 100 Days in Appalachia and on West Virginia Public Broadcasting's website. You're going to hear from many of Mountain State Spotlight's reporters in a minute, but I would be remiss not to shout out our co-founders, Eric Eyre, Greg Moore, Ken Ward Jr. They're waving in their little Zoom boxes at the top of the screen. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. All of you should be muted. Please keep it that way for the first part of the event. We'll open up to questions in a bit, so be thinking about either what you want us to hear or what questions you have about anything you've heard. If you aren't used to Zoom, if you aren't one of the people who has spent probably the last year on this platform, know that you can view the chat box by clicking the speech balloon that says chat at the bottom of the page. We'll be posting links there throughout the event. And if you think of questions while we're still talking, feel free to go ahead and post them in the chat. And lastly, if you'd like to change the way you see the people speaking, there are options to do gallery view where you can see everyone in little small squares, or speaker view where you see the person who's speaking in a larger box, and that is in the top right corner. And with that, let's get started. So first up, I'd like to introduce and for many of you, reintroduce Erin Beck. She is covering the legislative session for Mountain State Spotlight. And you might be familiar with Erin's work. She's a reporter for both the Charleston Gazette-Mail and the Beckley Register-Herald. And she's built a reputation for deep, thoughtful coverage of government policy. Hey, Erin.
Hi.
Okay, so let's get started. So first of all, the big issue that's already emerged as a priority for lawmakers is considering abolishing West Virginia's income tax. So tell me a little bit about what is the argument behind doing this?
The Republican leadership in the West Virginia legislature is arguing that it's going to bring a lot of people into the state for tax relief and just relieve tax burden on West Virginians in general.
Okay, so how much of our budget does, how much does the income tax contribute to our budget?
The most recent fiscal year, it was about $2 billion, about 43%. So okay. Pretty heavily reliant on the personal income tax.
Yeah, right. So if we get rid of this, what are lawmakers talking about putting in its place? Are we just going to lose $2 billion?
Basically, there was another legislative look ahead event where where the leaders in the West Virginia House of Delegates and in the state Senate talked about their views of eliminating the personal income tax. They both were supportive of it. The Senate seemed way more adamant about doing it. The Senate side, which is led by Senate President Craig Blair, he's given some really vague ideas for how you would pay for like such a huge chunk of the state budget to go away. Mainly like improving broadband and bringing in tourists and taxing those tourists and improving broadband so that remote workers would want to come to the state, and taxing those people, I guess. But I don't really see any way I haven't seen any evidence yet that could bring in that much money to the state budget. And then on the Republican side, the website Dragline, they reported on a leaked survey that the House leadership had sent to their members about what all they could stomach, basically eliminating in order to like, if you were going to have that much removed from the state budget. And that one looked kind of more realistic. It was things like, or like how you could, basically more realistic as in how you could actually get to $2 billion. And that was things like increasing the food tax or bringing back the food tax, increasing the sales tax, eliminating the Promise Scholarship, eliminating all funds to WVU and Marshall. And then the only thing that really wouldn't hurt in that list, that wouldn't hurt low income and middle income people the most, was they listed briefly increasing the personal income tax on the wealthiest earners. But all that other stuff, that would lead to disproportionately benefiting wealthier West Virginians, because like, you know, everybody pays the sales tax and everybody pays the personal income tax, but lower income people, you spend more of they pay more in sales taxes than in personal income tax, because they spend more of their money just on the activities of daily living, like going to the grocery store. They pay a tax they might pay a tax on their shampoo that they're buying, or clothes, that kind of thing. And wealthier people spend less money on just those daily activities. They have more money that can just sit and collect interest. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, it's a proportional thing, right? Like, shampoo costs the same no matter your income, but it's a bigger proportion of your income if you are lower income.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, is there, I know it's like the session hasn't started yet, and so I don't want to put you on the spot and ask you to, like predict what is going to happen, but it seems that this is a priority. This is something that lawmakers intend to seriously discuss, right?
Yes, they both have listed it at least as a priority. Like, I know anything can happen in a legislative session, but I do think there will be legislation that will be considered on this topic, and I do think there'll be probably pretty widespread opposition. One of the things that I don't think I listed this, but one of the other ways that the Republicans in the House side had listed as a way to pay for it would be reducing state money for all the state agencies that the state government funds, like the Department of Health and Human Resources and Education and Agriculture and whatever it may be. So all those people that work at those agencies are going to have thoughts about that. And then like left-wing groups like the West Virginia Center on Budget and Policy, they've already come out talking about how this would impact lower income people the most. So I definitely think, I can't predict, like whether it will pass or not, but I definitely think it's going to be like a contentious big subject during session.
Yeah, that's interesting. And we'll have some more out about that tomorrow.
Yes, that was like a little teaser for tomorrow's story, actually.
Okay, so let's talk real quick about education too. I mean, obviously that's been a big issue over the past couple of years, and I believe lawmakers have indicated that there's some education bills that are also a priority this year. So what are they saying? What do you expect?
They said that we can expect more school choice legislation, which when they say that, they usually mean that they want to bring charter schools to West Virginia, which, as we know from previous years, are they are also public schools, and that they also receive public funding, but they can be subject to less restrictions. And teachers unions have argued that they can hurt traditional schools because, like, it's the same amount of money going to a bigger number of schools, and the schools that we have are already in a dire need of maintenance issues and things like that. So yeah, I think they're going to be trying to bring charter schools here, even though we did pass the charter schools bill previously. It was, the charter school advocates were just like, they basically were like, you might as well have not passed the bill. This isn't really going to bring school choice to West Virginia. And then also, when they say school choice, they're also talking about education savings accounts, which are similar to what we used to call vouchers. You can basically, you can use public money to pay for things like sending your kid to private school, or sending your kid to a tutor, or you can use it for homeschooling. And advocates for that sort of thing have argued that basically they're taking what money would have been spent on the kid in the public school district, and they're letting the parents and the family decide how to best spend that money to meet the educational needs of their students. But on the other side, you have to also think about the fact that, like, say if a private school costs $10,000 in tuition per year, and the bill that was considered last time was $3,800 per education savings account, then the parents would have to have $6,000 extra to make up for it. So the argument is that it benefits people to have an extra $6,000. And I've also interviewed people that say, like, they like the idea of charter schools. Like, people in the education field, that they say they like the idea of charter schools. They like the idea of having more flexibility, and like having, just the school fit the student. But also, that would, like, I had some really compelling interviews with people that were pointing out, but also we have a really bad poverty problem in West Virginia, and we have a really bad opioid problem in West Virginia. And a lot of the parents are too focused on, like, immediate needs than focusing on, like, extras for their kids, getting their kids to a private school. Just they're focused on, this was even prior to COVID. They were telling me that a lot of parents are just more focused on, like, immediate needs, like day-to-day survival. Okay, this is all pre-COVID. So
Yes.
so I feel like that's going to be that's why I feel like we're going to hear a lot about that, probably, that in the middle of a pandemic, is this the time to put more I guess more responsibility on parents who are, like, struggling with all their with balancing everything already.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, charter school research specifically around the country has shown that a lot of times it's students who self-select into these programs because it's, like you said, it's parents who fill out the applications and drive their children to school and all these things. I think that's a good point. And thank you for those of you posting questions in the chat. Keep it coming, and we'll save those and get back to them in a little bit. Okay, and just to change gears real quick, Erin, before I let you go. This is a subject that I know is you're passionate about reporting, because it's really interesting. Let's talk about water quality standards, and specifically the can that was kind of kicked down the road last year, regarding the state's water quality standards and what you expect to happen this year. Tell us, first of all, what happened last year.
Yeah, I didn't know that I was passionate about it until what happened last year. But I thought you were getting ready to say the drug crisis deal, to be honest. But yes, water quality is a new passion of mine, because last year what happened was, in a rulemaking review committee at the legislature, which is typically, there's not a lot of reporters at those, because it's just like the legislators are, like, approving things that state agencies have put before them, like rules regarding the implementation of a law. So it can be kind of like nuts and bolts. But last year, the West Virginia Manufacturers Association asked the rulemaking review committee if they would not implement a rule that would implement stronger water quality standards based off of the fact that, like, this is going to sound crazy and I'll explain it, but like based off the fact that West Virginians are heavier and drink less water and eat less fish than the average American. And to be clear, the EPA does allow you to consider state-specific things when you're deciding. Like the EPA asks or tells the states to revisit their water quality standards every so often, and they say that you can consider state-specific factors. And it does say that things like fish consumption and how big your body is, that those affect how much pollution, how pollution will affect you. But at the same time, there was a big uproar about it because that's just kind of listing ways that West Virginians are already unhealthy, right? And we, the argument was we should be able to swim in our rivers and get more exposure to water, and we should be able to drink more. We should be able to drink more water, and we shouldn't be, we shouldn't be using the fact that we're heavier to say we can handle more pollution when heavier bodies are, prone to a lot more health problems anyways. So it became a very big point of contention, and they basically just, as you said, kicked the can down the road and decided to revisit it this year after the bill went back and forth like so many times. At the end of the session, I believe it was Senator Trump that said it was a compromise that pleased no one. I don't know that that's actually true, because the advocates, the environmental advocates, I don't think I don't think they asked them what they thought about the compromise before it happened. But they said that the reason they were doing that was to give the Manufacturers Association time to study the issue and present their findings before the legislature.
So we're expecting that possibly during this session.
Yes. So we'll get to finally see what happens. And a lot of people got really fired up over it last year, but it was it was right at the end of session. So I'm hoping people will remember it and, still be interested in things like water quality this year.
Well, thanks, Erin. And just real quick, because we gotta move on to some other reporters. Can you speak briefly about the drug crisis? Any talk from lawmakers? Is this an issue that's on their radar? We've been hearing that there's, likely an increase in overdoses, relapses, and issues like that through the pandemic.
During the legislative Lookahead event that I mentioned earlier this week, several leaders in the legislature talked about what their priorities were for a good while before Senate Minority Leader Stephen Baldwin mentioned that no one had said anything about the drug crisis, and he noted that that's a frequent occurrence at the legislature. So that doesn't that doesn't say to me that it's going to be a priority, since it didn't get mentioned until a member of the minority brought it up. But I mean, he did bring it up, so there are people there that are concerned with it. At this about some of the numbers that have been floating out around there, I do think that overdoses have increased. The CDC has reported that, and Cabell County, which I had an interview with this past week, is locally reporting that. But at the same time, Dr. Kilkenny of the Cabell Health Department mentioned to me that drug use has actually declined because of interruptions in the drug supply because of COVID. And there's also been some I don't know if hysteria is the right word, but a lot of uproar about suicides increasing because and using that as rationale for why people need to go back to work. And there's no evidence that I know of that suicides have actually increased. And I haven't seen much discussion about things that would actually reduce the suicide rate, and at the same time, the other mental health problems like drug overdoses, like things like instead of just trying to get everybody back to work, things like access to affordable health care. So
Okay, well,
I definitely plan to ask them about those topics though.
yeah, well, we will see. Thank you so much, Erin.
No
Okay.
problem.
Next up, Lucas Manfield. Hey, how's it going?
Hello, what's going on? Doing well.
So Lucas, you've been following a topic, another topic that lawmakers say will be a top priority this year, which is broadband. And this is something that also seems to be kind of a perennial issue. So as we know from your reporting, and as a lot of people know from firsthand experience, getting access to high-speed internet in a lot of parts of the state is rather difficult, if not downright impossible. So what's different about this year? What are lawmakers talking about?
What's different this year is that there's a lot of money. So basically, I mean, one thing they have been talking about, which I've been writing a lot about, is the hundreds of millions in federal subsidies that are coming down. And most of them are going to Frontier Communications, which is the cause of most of these problems in the first place. And lawmakers are pretty pissed about that. But frankly, they can't do too much about it because it's federal money. So if anyone remembers, I think it was late last year, don't remember which month exactly, the governor basically stood up with a bunch of Republican lawmakers at the Capitol and said, okay, we're putting 150 million bucks from the state coffers to do something about it. And this is also a big deal because that is a lot of money, and it's order of magnitude more than the state has ever really been willing to spend on this problem. So yeah, I mean, the question we're going to find out is how they're going to spend. I mean, first of all, are they going to do it? They promised to do it. We don't know if they're going to do it. And then also how they're going to give that money out.
Okay, so not to sound like totally pessimistic and skeptical about this, but I mean, we've kind of also seen similar stuff before, right? I mean, maybe not to the $150 million magnitude, but I mean, recently you reported that Governor Justice pledged to spend 50 million of CARES Act money on broadband. He spent 33 million, and of the 33 million, a lot went to things that could only, if you're being super generous, be called like broadband adjacent. So like, why do we think something's going to happen now?
Yeah, I mean, that's why this is so interesting, is that, yeah, the 50 million was a disaster, I think, on nearly every level. And I mean, it's made even worse by the fact that other states had the same problem. I'm thinking New Hampshire here, and they did very interesting, very good programs with that money. We didn't. And so, I mean, they might have spent the money on other things that were good, but it doesn't seem like it really went to solving the problem we wanted them to use it to solve. So yeah, I mean, and plus, if you look over the years, I mean, the state has wasted millions and millions of federal dollars by giving it essentially to Frontier. And then auditors have come in later and said the money was wasted. So the state just has this long history of taking a lot of money and not solving the problem. With that said, we also are a state where we have some success stories. And I mean, this is why this is what I found fascinating, is that we know how to do this. And people in the state know how to do this. We have companies, we have people that are taking leadership positions in this that realize that if you have people getting the money that really care and are in the community and are, have their hearts in the right place, we can solve this problem. So, I mean, I think legislators I think they know what they need to do, at least the people I'm talking to. There's a roadmap here. It's just, and it's a bipartisan issue. I mean, people on both sides really want to solve this problem right. So in that sense, I do have a lot of optimism. Like, I think we could do this. There's just a history of them not.
And real quick, there's a pretty pertinent question in the chat right now from Maggie Hutchinson. Why is the money likely going to Frontier? What about competitive bidding? Not to send you down this rabbit hole, which I know you understand really well, but yeah, can you answer that quickly?
Can I answer that quickly? Well, competitive bidding is the problem, right? Because Frontier is willing to bid lower than everyone else. And that's the fundamental issue here, is that when you open this up for competitive bidding, you actually open it up for abuse. So that is the problem people need to solve. Like, we want it to be competitive. We want it to be fair. We want companies that have the best proposals to win. The problem is, if you let the company with the cheapest proposal do it, you end up with a track record of disaster. So the question is, how do you decide which proposal is the best?
Yeah, and as you reported before, Frontier likes to bid low and make lots of promises that, you know, they have a spotty, to be generous, track record at actually following up on and keeping. Great. Thank you so much, Lucas.
No problem.
Next up, where are you, Lauren Peace? Right there. Hi. Hey, Lauren.
Hey.
Hey, okay, let's talk about health for a minute. We touched on the opioid crisis before, but Lauren Peace, you are our Mountain State Spotlight's public health reporter. Let's talk specifically about something you've been reporting on a lot lately, which is public health measures to try to stop the spread of infectious diseases like hepatitis C, HIV, that can be spread through people sharing needles to inject drugs. So this is something that's been really controversial in Charleston lately, and you've been following kind of the twists and turns of the conversation in the capital city. But politicians in the capital in Charleston will be talking about this likely this session as well. Can you tell me, first of all, like just a little bit of background? What is a needle exchange? When we say that term, what is that, and what is that meant to do?
Yeah, definitely. So needle exchanges fall under this umbrella of harm reduction. And harm reduction is it's sort of a philosophy. It's a strategy used by public health professionals that recognizes that humans take risky behavior and seeks to minimize those risks when we do take them. So instead of saying risk is black and white and you're either gonna, in the case of drug use drugs or not, it recognizes that there's a spectrum of risky behavior and therefore a spectrum of harm that it works to prevent. Needle exchanges in the context of injection drug use are a really important piece of harm reduction to first and foremost prevent the spread of infectious disease like hepatitis C, like HIV, which we have really high prevalencies of in West Virginia. And those diseases are transmitted primarily through sharing needles, dirty needles, and so the disease spreads. So syringe access programs, which is what we're sort of calling needle exchanges today, because it's not a one-for-one exchange. So syringe access programs have been around for decades. They are not controversial to the CDC, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, and they're really well supported in communities around the country, but there's a lot of controversy around them, and that controversy stems primarily from stigma. And we're currently seeing that controversy play out right now in Charleston, where we're seeing HIV rates rise exponentially, and debate around whether or not to allow syringe access programs, syringe distribution in West Virginia's capital city is ongoing. Does that sum it up?
Yeah.
It's a complicated topic. But...
Well, it is. And Ken has shared some links to your previous reporting in the chat. And I suggest if anyone's curious about some of the nuances that they read those stories too. Okay, so I know we really started talking about programs like syringe exchanges a couple of years ago after an HIV outbreak in Scott County, Indiana, which is only about 30 miles north of Louisville. Can you tell me a little bit about how needle exchanges generally are regulated in West Virginia on a statewide basis?
Yeah, so the way that needle exchanges are regulated around the country varies. It sort of falls into three buckets. One is that they're banned, they're outlawed, and that's throughout a number of states, primarily in the Midwest, actually. Another is that there's legislation in place at the state level which explicitly supports syringe access programs and protects them. And then there's states like West Virginia, one of, I think, less than 10 states that really doesn't have legislation in place. So we very much leave the jurisdiction to the local level. That means that we have counties in the state where syringe access programs are outlawed, but we also have counties that support needs-based programs. So Morgantown in Monongalia, for example, runs a needs-based program. The other counties are kind of, it's blurry. And I think that that's why we're seeing controversy in Charleston right now, is that law is ill-defined. There is a certification process through the state, so you can apply as a syringe access program to be certified by the state, but that's not required. And it's really just sort of a gold seal of approval that also gives you opportunities to apply for state funding rather than something that's required by law.
Okay, so last year in the legislature, there were two bills that were focused on either outright banning or restricting all needle exchanges in West Virginia. What are people saying this year? Are they going to reintroduce similar legislation?
The answer is we don't know. We haven't heard anything about it yet. I reached out to Senator Eric Tarr from Putnam County, who I think sponsored the bill last year to ban syringe distribution. And he has not gotten back to me yet. I'm going to give him a call again tomorrow. So we don't know. I would say that people who work in harm reduction circles are really concerned about it because of the introduction of a bill that would outlaw, syringe distribution last year. They fear that it'll be reintroduced, but we don't know yet.
And is this a partisan issue?
Not really. No, it's bipartisan, and we're seeing that play out in Charleston right now, where you have Democrats who believe that distributing syringes, again, which is supported by the U.S. Centers for Disease and Control, they believe that it's enabling drug use, and it's not. There's data that shows that people who have access to harm reduction programs are not more likely to inject drugs and are actually more likely to enter recovery when the time is right. So there are Democrats who believe that it's enabling, there are Republicans who believe it's enabling, and vice versa. There are Republicans who are in full support of the CDC standard and having harm reduction programs in our states, and Democrats who feel the same.
Okay, great. We'll be keeping an eye on this as the session continues. Thank you so much, Lauren.
Of course.
Okay, next up, Douglas.
Hello.
Hey, Douglas Soul, Watchdog Reporter. Okay, so let's talk about criminal justice briefly, Douglas. You've reported on several criminal justice issues over the past couple of months. There are a couple of things we know, right? We know that West Virginia's jails are overcrowded. That's true before COVID, and unfortunately it's true during COVID as well. We know a lot of people in jail, about as much as half are pre-trial, meaning they haven't been convicted. We know that Black people are overrepresented in West Virginia's jail population. And we also know there are a lot of hurdles facing people once they are released from jail. So tell me what you're hearing from legislators and from advocates about what criminal justice issues are going to be on their plates this session.
Oh yeah, so one of the more prominent ones that come to my mind, and so for background, I've been talking to West Virginia advocacy groups for people who are incarcerated, who were previously incarcerated, and their families for the past week, just about this legislative session. And these groups play a very influential role in the bills that are introduced and how far these bills go once they're introduced. And I talked about that to get a feel for the pulse of what different groups are interested in relation to criminal justice reform. And one potential bill that I know I'll have on my radar this session is one that is focused on recidivism, a term that refers to someone with prior criminal convictions engaging in further criminal activity after they are released. Why this occurs is a lengthy conversation involving numerous factors we unfortunately don't have time to dive into, but just know that it is something that is commonly occurring and something that those across the political spectrum want to reduce. The potential bill, which I hear from advocacy groups may have bipartisan support, is aimed at reducing recidivism through providing transitional housing and additional resources. It allows for the creation of a reentry and transitional housing program. I believe this program would identify individuals who would be put in a transitional housing situation where they will receive resources that are focused on academic education, social skills, self-discipline programs, substance abuse treatment, employment, and vocational education and counseling. They would be placed there up to, I believe, 6 months prior to their calculated discharge if this bill were to come to pass. This would ideally create a positive, instructive environment to help people who might otherwise get caught up in the cycle of recidivism. This goes really beyond some previous measures that come to mind that were passed to reduce recidivism, and it comes at a time when the state's regional jails are overcrowded by more than 2,000 people, and when COVID-19 outbreaks have occurred in both the state's jails and prisons. There's also, I understand, potential savings attached to this bill, since there is cost to housing people in jail and prison facilities, especially when individuals are returned to those facilities multiple times due to recidivism.
Yeah, so I mean, basically creating better safety nets to help ease the transition when people get out.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Great, that's interesting. And briefly, let's talk about another proposal that you've been hearing about, which is one to change the question that people are asked on, specifically on state job applications, right?
Mhm.
Pertaining to whether they have previously committed a crime. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so another potential bill that I'm keeping an eye on is a ban the box bill for job opportunities, as you said, within the state government. Bills of this sort have been introduced in the past, and I know past bills have been sponsored by both Republicans and Democrats, which is an indication of how it might fare. This bill might fare in our Republican supermajority legislature. These past bills, like thousands of bills each session, did not pass, but this iteration is one that, as I said, I'm keeping an eye on. As I talk about this bill, let me double emphasize, this does not apply to private employers. It only applies to West Virginia state employers. 13 states, as well as the District of Columbia, have laws that do apply to private employers, and more than 30 states have laws that apply to government employers. So we're really in a minority of states that doesn't have this as a state level, at the state level for government employers. If you've ever applied for a job, you've likely seen and marked a box that says something like, have you been convicted of a crime, yes or no? Well, just picture any employer that receives loads of applications. Unfortunately, as a quick way to weed out some applicants, some employers, like I said, unfortunately, may just immediately toss out the applications of those who had to check yes. While the background check would eventually be completed anyway, and thus the criminal history would be revealed, this bill would at least get these individuals with prior convictions in the door for a job opportunity in an interview where, if that criminal background comes up, they can talk candidly about it with their prospective employer. The bill would also lay out a standard for employers after that background check regarding the rejection of someone based on previous criminal convictions, such as the nature and gravity of offense.
Douglas, this just applies to state jobs at this point, right? I'm curious whether there's any talk about requiring companies that do contract, that contract with the state of West Virginia in requiring similar measures on their forms.
Yeah, I'd be curious about that as well. And one thing I am curious about, and I'm not completely sure on, is if this would apply to WVU Medicine, which is, the largest employer in West Virginia. And that's something I'm currently sifting through some organizations to get information about. And hopefully I'll know that sooner than later. And yeah, so like I said, these two bills are just two of the many that will likely be introduced for criminal justice reform. And because of this overcrowding situation, because of the racial injustice situation that's occurring in our state jails and prisons, it is definitely direly needed these are addressed. And these two are just ones that are prominent that I will be keeping an eye on, as well as many others that could be introduced and likely will be introduced this session.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Douglas.
No problem. Thank you.
And last but not least, Amelia Farrell Nisley. Here you go. Hey, Amelia.
Hi.
Okay, so you cover poverty for Mountain State Spotlight. And two of the topics that unfortunately, are kind of perennial topics in the state and we keep coming back to are hunger and foster care. These are still major issues in West Virginia, but there are a lot of unanswered questions, I feel like, about whether they'll be on lawmakers' minds during the session and what exactly is being proposed. So first of all, set the stage for us. Foster care, what have lawmakers done in recent years on this?
Sure. Before I go into that, I want to set the stage a little bit and give a snapshot of foster care in West Virginia. And right now there are about 7,000 kids in the foster care system. And this includes kids who have been removed from their homes, kids who are being raised by family members that the state knows of, and kids who are in the juvenile justice system. And I'm going to do an audience participation question. How many of you all are a foster parent, know a foster parent, or have a family member raising a child that is not biologically theirs? Is that some of us? Yeah. So it definitely is touching more and more West Virginians. It certainly has touched my family. And West Virginia has experienced a dramatic increase in kids coming into state custody because of a parent's drug use over the last decade. And our state removes kids from their homes at the highest rate in the country. And the majority of these removals are due to abuse and neglect connected to a parent's drug use. And there's also a shortage of social workers in our state. This is incredibly difficult work, and the pay isn't always great. And CPS workers can usually make more in our neighboring states. So that's kind of a snapshot. There's so much more, and there's so many foster care professionals on this call, but that's a little snapshot of of our foster care system. So in the last few years, there have been some pretty monumental pieces of legislation aimed at the foster care. Lawmakers like to group these bills under what they call foster care reform, but I think it's a little too soon to know if these bills have positively impacted the overburdened system. So just some of the changes they've made in the last few years include moving all health services for foster children and some other children receiving state services from a state-run program to a private company. And Aetna got that massive contract for the care of 18,000 children. And that's been underway for about a year. And I'm actually hearing positive things about that move. And this was an effort to streamline services for children around the state. And in an effort to recruit more foster families, lawmakers voted to increase the amount foster families receive from the state. The latest number I'd seen is that we have 4,000 foster families and 7,000 foster kids, but that number was pre-pandemic. So it's possible that family number has gone down in the last year. And our state also passed legislation that created a Bill of Rights for children and families in foster and kinship care. And foster care advocates have told me this was a really positive step.
Great. So, I mean, that's a lot of change, and that's a lot of change in recent years. Anything you're hearing they're going to be taking up, or that's kind of on a, on a fast track foster care wise this year?
No, I mean, I think Aaron touched on how the changes to our income tax might impact agencies. So of course, for me, I'm always going to be monitoring how does this impact DHHR? I mean, both with food and foster care, but specifically with foster care, I mean, it's a massive network of services that we have to offer these children, these families, the workers engaged with this work. So I'm going to be looking at, okay, if you're cutting programs, are those community services that you're cutting? Are you cutting money for our foster families? I'll definitely be watching that. But as far as legislation, there has not been any talk so far of specific foster care legislation.
Okay. And on hunger, we know that there are even more West Virginians experiencing hunger since the pandemic started nearly a year ago. What are the big issues that, if they aren't already on lawmakers' minds, should be on lawmakers' minds on this front?
Sure. So it really remains to be seen if increasing hunger is going to be on the minds. I've taken some calls and coffee meetings in the last couple of weeks from lawmakers wanting to talk to me about hunger, and I'm encouraged by that. But I will, if I can first touch on what I'm assuming is going to happen, and then I'll touch on what should happen. I'm hearing that there's going to be a bill out of the Senate that would reinstate drug testing for TANF. And TANF is a federal program that states run, which is temporary assistance for needy families. And of course, we've seen an uptick in people needing that nationwide during COVID. This was previously a requirement in our state, but it went away, and lawmakers are hoping to bring it back. And if they use the same mechanism they used in the past, how this works is that each TANF applicant fills out a questionnaire that screens them as a possible person using drugs. And then if they're flagged by DHHR, who administers the program, they have to go get drug tested. And the last time we used this, it required TANF recipients to pay for substance abuse if they were flagged, and it took away the money they could have used to pay for that substance abuse. And Aaron Beck actually wrote a story about this in 2018 when we were using it, and it turned out only 4 of 900 drug test came back positive. So what this does, besides stereotyping poor people as drug users, it also creates another barrier between our citizens and them getting help, especially right now, as families who have never needed assistance now do. And it's not only an additional step for applicants, but then if you are flagged, even if you're not using drugs, it's just more time between when you first fill out that application and you're getting money to help feed your family. And back to, you asked me, what should we be focusing on? I would like to see lawmakers focus on making the application process for SNAP and TANF and WIC less burdensome. It's a lot of paperwork. Fraud is very minimal in these programs, and we need to make sure, especially during a pandemic, that we're connecting West Virginians to the programs that can help them. However, I don't think this is going to happen since they're already hoping to add another application layer to TANF. And I think the last thing I'd like to see us focus on, or our lawmakers focus on, is just taking a critical look at our food charity infrastructure. So I'm sure everyone on this call can picture your community food pantry. And for a lot of you, including myself, that's probably a church food pantry. And the majority of our 400 food pantries in West Virginia are run by elderly volunteers who are not being paid. So I think it's really important, especially in the pandemic, that our lawmakers see that hunger is not going to be fixed by church food pantries, who are doing amazing work, but this is such a large program. And there are many ways lawmakers could go about addressing our charity system, but I think two really, I don't want to say easy, but what seemed like low-hanging fruit to me would be creating paid pantry positions and also helping these pantries get vehicles so they can go to our food banks and pick up food, and they're not using their own small cars, or they can only fit what they can fit in the trunk. So I don't know if those are things that we'll see addressed this year, but it's definitely something that I would hope would get some lawmaker attention.
Yeah, and just lastly, because this is something that we talked about a little when the other day when we were prepping for this event, it's just the transportation issue, right? Like, how do you solve that on a way that makes sense and is not, something that's just totally cost burdensome, and making sure that people who live in rural areas without transportation can access these programs?
Yeah, I really don't know the answer to that. I mean, it doesn't make sense to probably make a public transit system in Clay County, right? But a lot of our rural communities don't have bus systems. And then you're relying on elderly volunteers with their own vehicle to take the food out to them. And what we saw during COVID, once the school buses stopped running, is a huge breakdown in our food transportation system. We really have seen how many kids are fed at school and how many families don't have cars, rely on those kids bringing those backpacks of food home over the weekend. So it's not like the legislature can be Oprah and say, you get a car. But I mean, there is some real questions we have to ask ourselves, especially as more and more grocery stores close and dollar stores go up. How do we help our families without vehicles?
Great. Thank you so much, Amelia.
Sure.
Okay, so that's kind of the Cliff Notes version of some of the topics we're going to be following during the session. Though, as I think many of you know, sometimes at the onset, no one can actually predict what the biggest issues at the Capitol will be, and we are fully prepared to pivot as we need to. So now we'd really like to hear from you all. Do you have any questions about anything you've heard, topics you'd like our reporters to cover, any feedback about what kind of legislative coverage you feel is really needed in West Virginia? We're going to give you a minute. We'll let Lauren jump in one more time because she has something else to say. But if you have a question, post in the chat. You can ask your question in the chat, or you can just put your name in the chat and say, hey, I have a question. And then we'll call on you and have everyone unmute kind of one at a time. So go ahead and put a question or your name in the chat if you'd like to say something. And Lauren, you want to go ahead real quick?
Yeah, sorry, I'll just jump back in really quickly. I know we talked a lot about harm reduction because that's where my head exists right now. But I did just want to note a few other bills that are going to be introduced or at least considered. Delegate Barbara Fleischauer and Republican Matt Rohrbach are co-sponsoring a bill that is actually a follow-up on the one passed last year that seeks to lower copays for diabetes treatment and prevention. So last year, the bill passed capped copays for insulin at, I believe, $100. Someone else in the chat might know better than me, so feel free to comment. This year, they're introducing another bill that seeks to lower that copay even more and would also cap copays for supplies, equipment, and non-insulin drugs that would treat diabetes. The thought being, if we pay a little bit more upfront, we'll avoid really serious long-term costs to treating the negative effects of diabetes in the long term. And then another bill that I would be amiss if I didn't mention is the reintroduction of the Minority Health Advisory Task Force bill. If we didn't know it already, the pandemic has certainly highlighted unequal access to medical care and disparities across race and health outcomes. Right now, Black West Virginians are being vaccinated at about half the rate of white, even though there's higher prevalencies of comorbidities. And we have sort of a long rambling history in the state that I'm happy to speak with people more about and that I'll be reporting about later when it comes to addressing disparities in minority health. And so hopefully this session will take much needed steps to work on that. And I'll go away now, but we focused on harm reduction so much. I just wanted to mention those other pieces.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Sally Roberts Wilson has a question that is either for Erin or Douglas or Amelia, but it's the COVID relief funds were slated to address hunger. Will the legislature make a bid to have more of a voice on how COVID monies are spent? I don't know which of you would like to take that one, but feel free to unmute and give it a shot.
I'll jump in. I mean, what I know is that I don't know. I mean, I don't think, I think it's very up in the air how that will go. I do know that I actually just got from the auditor's office the most updated amount of CARES Act remaining. Let me pull up the amount. Yeah, so as of today, there is 665 million plus CARES Act dollars remaining. And just for conjure, I mean, just for historical background, the state got that money in a 1.25 billion amount back in April. So it's had a lot of time to spend it, yet 600 plus million remain. So I haven't heard any like set indication of that happening, but it's definitely something that I will be interested to see. And I don't know if any of the others here have heard anything for sure yet.
I haven't heard anything, but I will add that every time I check in with the auditor with like the same email, like, hey, has the governor spent any money on food relief? Hold on a second. Sorry. She does not like my answer. He always tells me he doesn't have a breakdown of how counties spend their money. So if you're someone in your community who's interested in knowing how your local CARES Act money has been used, I would contact your local government and say, have you spent any of your allotment of CARES Act money on hunger?
Thanks, Amelia. C. Brian Doherty wants to know, will or has there been anyone keeping track of COVID outbreaks at schools as they open up and numbers of students, teachers, and other school personnel infected, hospitalized, and deaths tracked? Lucas, you might know the answer to what data the state is keeping. I don't believe that is among it. Am I right?
I haven't checked this super recently. They have been kind of going back and forth with how much data they're putting out. I mean, last time I checked, they were, I don't even remember, honestly. But yeah, I'd have to go back and check.
Okay, that's a good question though, and we will we'll follow up with you on that. Great. There are a bunch of questions too about, there were a bunch of questions earlier in the event about capital access, which is something I know we've all been thinking about as there are restrictions on who can get into the Capitol and how the sessions will be broadcast and such. Erin, you wanna take that one?
Sure. It's a little different on each side. Okay, so I'll start with the House. I'll start with the Senate. Okay, so the Senate already has like better technology basically than the House side because they do live video of their committee meetings. At the same time. And then they're also kind of more spread out in the Senate as well. So we'll be able to watch that virtually. And then on the House side, they are going to have some of their meetings that would normally be in committee rooms in the House chambers so that they can be spread farther out. And since they don't have video capability in their conference rooms, they do have it in the House chambers. So you can also watch that virtually. Like press is going to be allowed in for some things and not some other things. So, but if it is, so we have like somewhat limited access, but the public is who I'm really concerned about the most, of not having the chance to really have face-to-face meetings with their lawmakers or get them to answer the phone or whatever it may be. And then I was going to tell you one more thing about access. I don't know, I forget. Sorry.
No, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I mean, like one of the things we've been watching kind of is who will get access. You know, well-connected lobbyists will probably still get access to lawmakers. It might be harder to watch what's going on if these gatherings are happening outside of the Capitol, or you know, in private homes such as that. But yeah, we're concerned about, as members of the media, of having access to people when you can't just talk to them after a floor session. And I think that goes doubly for the public.
Oh, and speaking of that, I just remembered that the Democrats, I think it was Senator Baldwin. They also mentioned that they were going to have a bill to ban lobbyists taking lawmakers out to dinner in the evenings, because they were mentioning that they also were concerned about that influence. So that could be also something to watch. It doesn't solve the problem of the public getting more access though. So, oh, and they did talk about the Democrats also did talk about virtual office hours as well for people who want to know what's going on in like weekly meetings. I think I might have heard a couple of Republicans mention that as well. So that's something to watch out for.
Great, thanks, Erin. From Valerie Woody, at least 18 states have introduced anti-transgender legislation this year alone. Many would bar transgender students from participating in school sports and or would require invasive genital exams. Is there any indication of interest in anti-trans legislation in West Virginia this year? Have you heard anything about that, Erin?
I mean, I think she's referring to. Is she referring to? Are you referring to RFRA when you talk about the requiring genital exams? I don't know how.
Okay, we can come back to that one.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, but we will be keeping an eye on it if that is kind of an issue this year. Oh, and from Anne, who is on this call as well, that the Capitol is still closed to the general public due to the governor's March executive order, but the press should have the same access as previous years. And she's willing to facilitate interviews. So thank you so much for that, Anne. Great. Anything else? By the way, the chat has been really great during this as well, and it's great to see everyone talking to each other about all these issues. West Virginia has been at the bottom or near the bottom among states of refugee placement. There are fewer than 5 refugees placed in West Virginia per year, even pre-pandemic. Are there barriers to placing immigrants, refugees at any level, and are there efforts to increase those numbers? That's from Chad. Sorry if I mispronounced your name, Chad Ifa. That's a really good question, and that is not something that is on my radar right now. Any of you all looked into this yet?
I wrote a story when I was at the Charleston Gazette Mail last year about how we only resettled 3 refugees. This would have been 2019. I wrote it early 2020. I don't know all the specific barriers, but I was told by Catholic Charities, which is our only resettling agency in West Virginia, that we do have some of the strictest requirements to come here as a refugee. And I do know one of the requirements is that you have to already have a family member living in West Virginia. and there's a paperwork process that follows that. And I'm really grateful, Chad, that you included that question, because that's a nudge for me to kind of update my reporting on that. And I'll be sure to ask about that now that we've finished out 2020.
I can also tell you that the House of Delegates, what the Public Safety Committee, like every year they consider legislation that would make it harder for refugees to settle in West Virginia, and every year they just adjourn in the middle of the meeting because they realize they don't have support for it. So that's, I don't know about the decreasing barriers, but I can tell you about that they generally consider and then vote against increasing barriers even more. They've considered bills that would basically just make it harder for refugees to settle here, because they would have to like things like having to send their address to police officers before, like where they'd be settling before they could move to a city, and like that all these different people would have to approve it first, just making it a very overwhelming process.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting too that there was an article that I'm sure most of the people on this call have seen, that was in the New York Times about today, how West Virginia can leverage its newfound fame with the position that Senator Manchin is in, that mentions specifically refugees. And one solution that the state could consider to the dwindling population issue is bringing in refugees who want to live in communities and revitalize them. So that was interesting. Bunch of questions now. Fairness. Is there any discussion among the Republican majorities about serious movement on the Fairness Act, especially after Governor Justice's very public endorsement previous to Election Day?
I mean, I will look into that, Andrew. I don't know right now. I mean, he knows just as well as I do what usually happens every year, and this year hasn't seemed too different from me yet, but maybe I'm wrong.
Will you be covering bills related to reproductive health care, more specifically related to abortion access? Yes, we will. This is also probably a good time to mention that we are a small team. We will be covering, our goal in the session is going to be covering things with depth, and not doing stories about every single bill or every single time a bill clears a hurdle. However, we are working on a tool which we hope to unveil for you all in the next week, that will make it easier for us to track bills, and we hope it'll make it easier for you to do that as well. It'll make it easy to see who's representing you. One of our goals is to empower people with our reporting to, whether they like a measure or don't like a measure, to let their lawmakers know about it. As well as to see kind of where a bill is in the process and how far it has to go, and how close it is to becoming a law. So we will have that for you very soon. It's being built by Lucas as we speak. And that goes into to Crystal Good's really great question: how can we help? And one of the ways that that you all can help is by giving us feedback. Tell us what you want to read. Tell us what you want us to cover. And tell us what you think is missing from our coverage. We don't want this conversation to be the end of this. We'd like to keep listening to you, and you can do that kind of any way you want. We are all very easy to reach on social media, on email. I'm happy to jump on a call with anyone who wants to talk about issues as well.
Can I answer the anti-transgender legislation question real quick?
Yeah, go ahead, Erin.
I was thinking about it a little more, and I realized like the reason that it was kind of hard for me to wrap my head around that question is because we already don't have protections for transgender people. So it doesn't really make me like perk up when I would see a bill come across my screen that's anti-transgender, because they're already not protected. So it's like a double negative or something. I don't know. But as Fairness West Virginia brought up, there is at least some Republican support for a bill that would extend protections in housing, employment, and public accommodations to LGBT people this year.
Thank you. Will West Virginia ever have auto emission standards? Ken, that might be a question for you, not to put you on the spot, but I know you've reported on this topic in the past.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Erica. It seems very unlikely, given the current configuration of the West Virginia legislature, that anything would pass that would more strictly regulate something like that than what the federal government's already requiring. That given, that said, President Biden is talking about reinstituting a lot of Obama administration rules, including some about that particular issue. And so I would think that you could look for West Virginia legislators to do things like consider resolutions to oppose those kinds of moves by the Biden administration.
Great, thanks, Ken. I think that is a lot of the questions. Anyone want to get a last question in before we wrap up?
I'm just
Okay.
curious what the best ways to engage with the legislatures, with our legislators, will be considering limited access.
I'm sorry, Corey, you were breaking up a little bit. You're asking what limited access means, or what legislators are going to be doing outside of the Capitol?
I'm curious what the best way to engage our legislators would be from an outside perspective, I guess.
I do not know if I have the expertise to answer that question. Anne, would you like to weigh in?
Did you say Aaron or Anne?
I said Anne.
Okay.
I would assume, though, a good way to reach legislators is email, phone. The reality, I think, is that a lot of citizens are camping out at the Capitol to talk to their lawmakers in person, even in a non-pandemic year. That's just not feasible for a lot of people. Yeah, and Valerie points out that Delegate Walker is on this call. So thank you, Delegate Walker. I think Delegate Young is on this call as well. So some legislators are clearly seeking out people to hear what they have to say.
Hi, I will just try to weigh in quickly. I had every intention to leave my camera off and not participate.
All right.
But since you asked directly, I realize as the House Communications Director, I am the information source for the entire House. But I really can't tell you how each lawmaker wants to be contacted. I'm sorry. Everyone has their own preferences. As someone pointed out, some will actively participate in things like this. Some will ask their constituents for feedback. A lot of them are active on Facebook, but not all of them. They all have House emails. They all have House, and by that I mean House of Delegates phone numbers. So I would truly try anything and everything and try to, as best you can, make relationships with them so that they know that you are a real human, most of the time real constituents. I do think that goes a long way. If you are in someone's district, they are a little more likely to listen to you. I hope that helps, guys.
Thank you, Anne. Okay, and with that, I think we're going to wrap up. A few quick plugs before you all go. If you aren't already signed up, please take a minute and sign up for our weekly email newsletter. Ken is posting the link in the chat. It is a good way to stay kind of up to date with what we're doing. And of course, a reminder that Mountain State Spotlight is a nonprofit newsroom. We don't have a paywall. We don't charge you a subscription fee to read our work, and that will always be the case. But we do ask that you support your reading, support investigative nonprofit journalism in West Virginia, if you're able to, with a gift of whatever amount works for you. And the link to donate should be in the chat too, or at the top right corner of our website. And lastly, again, we don't want this to be the last time we hear from you. This slide shows 4 ways you can contact us. And if you know of something we should be covering, please drop us a note and let us know. Thank you all so much. I can't believe there are so many people who would sit on a Zoom call to listen to us talk about the legislature. We are so lucky to have such an engaged and informed audience. So thank you all very much, and I hope you all have a good night.
Okay, tell them bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.